Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. We're going to discuss a new standard that's in development on the very important subject of quality management in construction. But before we begin, I would like to introduce you to our speakers today. I'm Sally Swingewood. I'm the Lead Standards Development Manager in BSI for this area of work and the Committee Manager for the Quality Management Committee. Ian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sally. And hi, everybody. Good afternoon. So just as a very brief introduction as to who I am, I'm currently a sector lead in the built environment team at BSI. I worked out recently that I've been at BSI for almost 18 years, which is an interesting stat in itself. But I started out life as a standards development manager or a program manager. It was last called back then. And then moved on to managing a team of standards development managers and lead standards development managers in various areas. I've worked in sectors such as sustainability, digital sector, health and safety, and of course quality. And I worked out that in some point in my career at BSI, I've been involved in pretty much all of the big management system standards: 14, 9, 27, 50, 45,001. A little bit like management system bingo at one point. So my most recent career change, as I say, is joining the built environment team as a sector lead, and currently working with Sally and the team and Nikki on the quality management in construction British standards. And we'll be looking at that more closely in this session. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Ian. And Nikki, who's our technical expert with us today, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, afternoon everybody. I'm Nikki Wells and I'm the Quality and Compliance Manager at the O'Keefe Construction Group.
And Nikki, I believe this is the first time you've been involved in standards development. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely, Sally, it is. Although every single day of my working life, I live, sleep and eat standards.
So you're well versed in standards, but you haven't actually drafted one before. So welcome to our world. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to give you all just a little bit of background to where we're at. I'm sure everybody in this session is aware of ISO 9001. It's the world's most widely used standard, quality management systems requirements, and it is widely used in the built environment sector. It's often a tender requirement, so you can't even apply for a tender unless you have certification to 9001. But despite this, and despite wide certification, we are still encountering quality failings in this sector. And these have really come to light in recent years. And there is a sense of urgency that we do need to do something to help improve quality management in the built environment, and particularly perhaps in construction itself. Now, other sectors, including aerospace and automotive, have already developed additional specific requirements which they use with ISO 9001 to make sure their specific issues in their specific industries are addressed in areas where, although 9001 on its own should cover them, perhaps people need a signpost to them. So that's working well for them. And at a workshop early in this year, a broad range of stakeholders from the built environment sector and also accreditation bodies, certification bodies, insurance companies, other interested parties agreed it would help. So we began to look at this. In the meantime, we have since formed a new technical committee under the parent Quality Management Committee, but which is being populated by a great deal of people from the built environment sector rather than quality management sector, though those people are also involved. We're bringing the two areas together to make sure we can share our expertise and really address the issues that are coming to light. So the intention is to develop a set of specific requirements, much as they have in aerospace and in automotive. Initially, this is only going to be a British standard. It won't be an ISO standard. We want to develop something relatively quickly, and that's much easier to do on a national level than an international level. But also, before we do think about saying perhaps this should be a global standard, we want to market test it. We want to get it out there and see if what we're producing really does add value, if it is addressing the needs of the industry. So it's going to support 9001 certification. It won't necessitate the need for new schemes to be developed. It will be more a case of auditors auditing those additional requirements whilst they look at 9001 requirements for certification. Work began on developing a very early preliminary draft in October, so it is very, very early days, but we are hoping to publish within 12 months. Any of you who've been involved in developing a standard knows this can be a challenge. We will go out to public consultation. We will have to address the comments, and there is a lot of interest in this work. So we don't expect it to be easy, but we do expect it to be valuable and exciting. I think everybody involved in it is quite excited by the possibility of developing something that really speaks to the industry and which the industry can embrace. So let's have a look at the current situation. Ian, do you want to talk a little bit about the sector as a whole in the UK?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sally. And some of these statistics that will come out of this slide are probably familiar to those of you that are already working in the sector, but for others it's interesting to see what we're looking at when we refer to built environment in the UK. As you can see, the number of construction firms operating in the construction industry continues to rise, reaching its highest level on record, just over 325,000 registered firms operating in Britain. This is back in 2018. We talk about that number, it's an increase of 11,000 firms compared with the year before, around 3.5% rise versus 2017. In terms of quarterly construction output this year, it grew by a record 42% in Q3 compared with the previous quarter, driven by record quarterly growth in both new work and repair and maintenance. Increase in new work in Q3 this year because of record quarterly growth in all new work sectors. Largest contributor was private new housing, which grew 84% in Q3 compared with Q2. I mean, there's various terms of market segmentation within built environment and construction, and I recall, Sally, this came up in our conversations where people were asking, well, what do you really mean when you try and standardise and use construction? But we have construction in terms of design and build, there's infrastructure, manufacturing, facilities and asset management, decommissioning, repurposing and demolition. And in terms of the value of this sector, of course, you have to sort of bear in mind that a lot of this is pre-COVID. Construction, infrastructure and facilities management sectors contributed 808 billion to UK GDP, which is around 43%. It's one of the largest sectors in the UK economy, as you can imagine, with a turnover of 370 billion, contributing 138 billion value added to the UK economy, employing over 3 million people, which is 9% of total workforce. So I think it's expected this output will continue to grow. We're talking trillions worldwide by 2030, and that I think is driven a lot by the top three countries of China, the US and India, accounting for 54% of global growth in construction to 2030. If we equate this to the topic that we're looking at today and a more sort of standardisation in the UK perspective, you've got the third anniversary of Grenfell Tower tragedy, having public inquiry published its phase 1 report. There's a clear need for us to support the built environment sector even more than ever. Example of this, we're continuing to work with and support government departments such as MHCLG, BEIS, Home Office, Health and Safety Executive, as well as all of those sector and industry groups such as Construction Innovation Hub, CPA, CIBSI, Construction Leadership Council and many others. In fact, Sally, I see in the Q&A somebody has Paul, I think, has asked. I don't know if this is the right point to pick up the fact that Paul has pointed out how we integrate this initiative with a construction planning framework being developed by the CIH. So, I mean, they are represented on our panel. So undoubtedly there are some representatives of CIH listening in today, and they're helping us draft this standard. So the material that they are producing will play a part as we draft requirements in this. I hope that answers Paul's question. In terms of the strategic groups that we have within the built environment sector at BSI, we have Peter Cableman working with us as chair of CB-Dash, and Sir Ken Knight doing sterling work with FSH0, the Fire Strategic Committee. And there are formal standards and PAS Flex documents being sought and developed as we speak. And then, of course, we'll touch on later the Building Safety Bill, which we're covering in a little bit. So I think that gives us a perspective of what we mean by built environment sector in the UK.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, Ian, that you mentioned the figures that you're presenting to us here on this slide include facilities management, they include asset management. And of course, both of those sectors already have a dedicated management system of their own. So what we are endeavouring to produce now certainly won't be touching on those topics that are covered by those existing and well-established standards. We will be concentrating more on other aspects of the built environment sector. And I think it's just worth remembering that all of these standards should be complementing each other. There should be no overlap, but also that we are in the very, very earliest stages. So somewhere, David Martin has asked if there's a definition of what the built environment sector covers. We as a committee developing this work have not fully defined yet what we are or aren't covering. We're still exploring it. We're still trying to determine what are the right boundaries for this standard. So taking into account the fact that the asset management and the facilities management sectors already have a management system standard, those won't be included in our standard as such, other than generically. So I think whilst we're having these discussions, please do bear in mind that this is very early and we are still working it out. We want people's inputs. If people feel we should cover demolition, but we shouldn't cover something else, then we need to know about it. This is very much a response to an industry need. It is a response to our stakeholders. It is not BSI or the Quality Management Committee driving anything. It is definitely the industry driving this. So let's go on. And I'd like to just explore a little bit more about how ISO 9001 can deliver more value than perhaps it currently is delivering. Ian, do you want to just start us off, and then we'll turn to you, Nikki, for a more detailed look at this?
Yes, thanks, Sally. And I won't dwell too long because I think Nikki's got probably the greatest insight as she comes from this world more than I do. But if we look at the state of play for the built environment sector at the moment, 9001 is not seen to provide perhaps as much value to users as it could within this sector, other than perhaps for bids and contracts. It's almost a necessary evil, almost required in order to win work, rather than really becoming something that they can see really is adding value to the business. But potentially there's that lot of trust in the standard as an indicator of organisational capability, not really achieving its intent, which ultimately we believe is to promote continuous improvement, which is what 9001 generally will always try and do. So the danger here is that without any action, the standard could become less relevant going forward. We're going to touch on later the regulatory aspect of it, but as greater regulation is applied to the industry. 9001 isn't really seen as an element of an organisation's approach to risk management. So the approach that came from our stakeholders overwhelmingly stated that a specific set of requirements, you touched on this earlier in your intro, Sally, an extra set of requirements for implementation of 9001 construction would really be of enormous help. And I'm sure, Nikki, you can probably add a bit more meat on those bones with your experiences.
Yeah, so from my own personal experiences, a lot of the companies that I've either worked for or worked with, when they've achieved their ISO 9001 certification, that doesn't always necessarily mean to the contractor that they're actually going to get a better service at all. Sometimes completely the opposite. I believe that the current standards or the current ISO is it's able to be fudged. People can get through an ISO 9001 audit and achieve their certification fairly easily. We do focus an awful lot, or I say we, when we're being audited, there's lots of focus around how we actually do things rather than the actual outputs. And I think it's really important that maybe we look at changing or adding to this standard stroke ISO to actually demonstrate more on what the outputs are rather than how we do things. I'll give you an example for argument's sake. So as a company, we look to engage with supply chain. And one of the requirements that we have is that we would like the people that we're engaging with to have an ISO 9001 certification, because that implies that they've already been approved, for want of a better word, that they are following the principles, okay? And it's a requirement that we have an ISO 9001 with our clients. Now, when you're actually working with your ISO, you are writing and working to process and procedures to be able to deliver the outputs, okay? Now, the question I need to ask really is, whose method are we actually going to be working to? Because our ISO certification, our ISO processes may be completely different to those of the people that we're engaging with. It doesn't actually say whose method we're working to. So there's a bit of conflict. And I can give you a perfect example of that as well in working practice. Am I allowed to mention companies that I've worked for? Is that allowed? I'm not actually 100% sure. I'm going to be brave. Let's go for it. So I worked on the Woolwich train station project at Woolwich for Crossrail. And as a working for Balfour Beatty, we had a set of process and procedures, and we expected our supply chain to work to those. Our client, Crossrail, equally had processes and procedures that they'd used to achieve their ISO 9001. And they wanted us to manipulate our processes to align themselves to theirs. So there's one question: whose processes are we following? But equally, we did exactly the same with our subcontractors. We asked them to change their systems to suit ours. Now, we engaged a lot with professionals, specialists, certainly with concrete, for argument's sake. We're employing these individuals as specialists. They are supposed to know far more about concrete, for argument's sake, than we do. Okay, so why would we be asking them to change their systems to align themselves to ours? So it's just little things like this that kind of hinder you actually following the ISO or at least understanding it. Like I say, it can be fudged. We've got this perfect example at the minute with Celotex where they've fudged the testing results so that they can use the cladding and the fireproofing. So yeah, for me, that's kind of a hindrance at the moment. I think we should just concentrate really on outputs. Let's go through the life cycle of the project, beginning, middle and end. And what are we actually asking them to produce to confirm that everything is compliant? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve, isn't it?
Thanks, Nikki. So is it the standard itself? Is it ISO 9001 itself, or is it the application of this standard? I mean, I know we have an issue in this sector that certification is given to an organisation. Mm-hmm. So you may have 20, 30, I don't know, 100 organisations if you go from very small organisations to larger organisations. And but yet you work on projects.
Yes.
So the project hasn't got an ISO 9001 certificate. The organisations have, and so you've just been explaining the conflict there. So do you think it is the standard, or is it how we're using it, how we're looking at it, and how we're working together?
I think the standard itself is actually robust. I want to put that out there to start with. But I think it's the way that people apply it and the way they understand it. And in some ways, it almost needs to be maybe more specific so that you can't make your own judgment on what it is that you're having to deliver or need to deliver. But the actual standard itself is robust. I get it. It's good. It's robust.
So is this something where we need to perhaps help with the specific requirements to enable auditors to audit in a way that adds value, that kind of thing? Is that what we are trying to achieve here?
Yeah, definitely. So being an auditor myself, it's actually quite difficult sometimes to be able to prove or to evidence what a lot of these companies are suggesting that they do. Yeah. So if you can prove it, that's fantastic. And understanding the standards is probably the biggest issue. These companies don't necessarily understand it. The same as a lot of companies don't actually understand quality, to be fair, from my experience, personal experience.
Okay, so one of the things we can do in this is perhaps define more what quality means in this sector, to this sector, to perhaps give an overview to those organisations who are using it.
I think that's really important, and I think that's fundamental. If we want people to be able to carry out their works in line with these standards, we need to make sure that they understand the why. Why are we doing this? You know, a lot of people see equality and standards to some degree as a bolt onto their day job, and they need to understand that it is their day job.
Absolutely. Ian, do you want to add anything about interpretation of the standard or implementation, any of those issues?
Yeah, it reminded me in a way of the journey that I guess the Occupational Health and Safety Standard went on, ISO 45001, published in 2018, and I think that there is a suite now of supporting standards for that relate to implementation and interpretation. Maybe more so because that one was a new standard. But when you're drifting into a particular topic like we are here, we've seen this from the sessions that we've run with the experts, in that they point out that this is an enormous topic to try and standardize. So the more that we can dig down and provide some guidance to make the requirements of 9001 more specific to those challenges that Nikki was talking about, when you go on the site, you're able to then interpret what is a generic standard and make it applicable to the day job. And that's a massive tool to be able to provide the industry. Funnily enough, I was going to say about the energy management standard many years ago, where they had a concern about the auditors and not having the competence in energy in order to be able to assess a company. But Nikki's now said that she's an auditor herself. So I'm trying not to be disrespectful to those people that do. Present company accepted, of course, Nikki. But again, just to talk on a very basic level about the panel that we have, we obviously have UCAS and ABCB representation on the panels. They will help guide us as we develop the standard, I'm sure, from a certification and accreditation point of view.
So Kevin from UCAS is just asking us to clarify. The intention is not to create a standalone management system standard. It is definitely an extension to 9001. We're not seeking to replace it. We are just seeking to enhance it for this industry. So we would still expect all of the organisations in the built environment to get their ISO 9001 certificate, but with these additional requirements. That is our hope. That's our intention.
Do you mind if I just add something there, Sally?
Sure.
And that is, listen, no offence taken whatsoever in it. It's absolutely fine. I just want to point out that by being an auditor, you don't necessarily need to be an expert in every field that you're actually auditing. And I think it's really important that people understand that the standard or the ISO, as an auditor, it kind of guides you in what it is you're looking for anyway. And a lot of it is common sense, to be fair. But you certainly don't need to be an engineer to be able to audit an engineering team. So, and I'm definitely not an engineer, and I never profess to be either. I'm just a quality professional.
Thank you, Nikki. Dave Sheedy in the questions has asked us to mention that we do have representation on our construction quality committee from an accreditation body, UK Cares, as well. And so it's very important that I think it's important for everyone to understand that we are trying to include absolutely as many stakeholders in this environment as we can. We want to make sure that whatever we produce works. We want to make sure it works for, you know, the two-person electrician company, Balfour Beatty, UCAS, certification bodies, and the end user of the buildings we're putting up, or the rail tracks that the rail systems that we're building, or the highways that we're building. We want everybody to win from this. So, you know, we will make sure that we speak to as many people as we can and get as many people involved as we can. And it is a growing committee, which is fantastic. It's exactly what we need. We need this conversation to make this work. Paul in the chat has asked if the standards will include documented linkages to the ISO framework. Not entirely sure what the question means, Paul, but we will follow the structure of ISO 9001. We are unlikely to reproduce all of 9001, but it will be a case of each section will say, in addition to meeting the requirements in ISO 9001 2015, the organisation shall also. So it will follow the structure, and ISO 9001 will be a normative reference to this document.
Amongst others, I suppose we should say, Sally, is again one of the pieces of work that is almost apparent from the outset is how many standards will overlap on this. We'll touch on a few of them later, but there's a big terminology aspect to this as well, where we're linking into construction terminology experts. So, you know, that cross-referencing, that bibliography, that normative reference aspect will be huge. And the team that are working with us to draft this is really helpful in terms of directing us to existing standardization.
Yeah, absolutely. There is absolutely no need to rewrite things. There's a lot of good work going on out there, and this standard will signpost all of the other resources. A lot of it's guidance, it's not all requirements. It doesn't necessarily need to add massive additional burdens to organisations, but it can provide really valuable insight and guidance. So let's have a look at this question of manufacturing parts elements of the built environment. And of course 9001 suits manufacturing very well. It's where it came from really historically, but 9001 also deals with services, and in this context that is the activities, the processes that you provide if you are a certain type of organisation and you specialise in concrete or whatever. You're not just giving a lump of concrete, you are laying the concrete, you're mixing the concrete, you're making it work. So can it address both well in this sector? Is this where the problem is lying currently? What do you think? Nikki, maybe first?
What do I think? Do I think that it covers both? I'm not convinced it does. I'm not convinced it covers both, if I'm honest. I think this is probably one of the challenges that we're going to have between organisation and projects. It's easier to work with off-site fabrication because obviously you can control the assurance better. I'm just not convinced that it currently covers both. No.
Okay, Ian, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way it echoes the type of conversations we're having around health and safety as well for off-site construction, in that there is a distinct difference there. And Paul touched on the construction innovation hub's quality planning framework earlier, and it's an offshoot of that conversation that the work that they are doing suggested that perhaps health and safety for off-site is a slightly different piece. So I'm no expert in terms of sort of off-site side of it, but I think it seems to be the direction that a lot of manufacturing and construction is going these days. I think it just seems to add a different aspect to it, that you then have to transport those products to the site, which brings with it a sort of a layer of risk in terms of the breakages that can happen during transportation, taking that into account, additional costs of transportation, skilled labour you need on site once they arrive there. So it brings into this whole issue of competence and project planning, which I think we can touch on a bit later as well. So yeah, I don't know that side as well as the construction experts do, as Nikki said, but I think time will tell as to whether or not we can cover both of those same amount of depth.
Yeah, I think, as somebody, I do know ISO 9001 2015 quite well, and I was involved in a lot of the discussions when the requirements were being written. And there was a huge, very involved debate about this concept of products and services. It addresses products and services. And even within that international community of quality experts, which really does include a broad spectrum of people, there's an absolute desire that ISO 9001 can be applied to everything. But there is still an awareness that perhaps unless you really understand the intent of all the requirements, it's quite difficult to apply if you're not producing a thing, a product in a very tangible, specific way. If we're producing widgets, we know the widgets that our clients want. We've agreed what the widget looks like and how big it is and what its function is. And so it's fairly obvious in some ways how you can quality assess that through its various stages of manufacture, production, delivery to your client. It's perhaps more complicated to do the same thing for, I'm going to provide this series of services for you on this project. So although I think many quality purists, 9001 purists, will say the standard is absolutely suitable for both, perhaps it comes back to what we were talking about before, that it's understanding how it applies to both. How do I implement that in my particular corner of the world? Would you agree?
Yeah, I think I would. I've actually just lost my screen.
Well, we can still see you, Nikki, which is very useful.
Dave Sheedy asked made a point in the Q&A, Sally, just to say that his thoughts at this point are that it's possible. The way we're beginning to draft may well illustrate that. But I think as we go forward, one of the things that might be quite interesting to do is start to look at case studies here and work with some organisations to strength test how robust this standard is in both sides. So I think that's an interesting thing for us to explore.
It leads us very well, actually, Ian, thank you, to our next slide, where I was going to ask Nikki to give us a sort of real life example of how supply chain requirements can make it difficult to meet necessary quality levels and meet requirements in a meaningful way. Do you want to say a bit more about that, Nikki?
Yeah, so I mean, I touched upon it earlier on, and I gave that example of the concrete specialist. So that obviously still applies. I think my worry is that we undermine perhaps the specialists that we're using. As another example, let me just have a quick think for a second. Yeah, I think we've just got to be really careful, because what we've got is you generally find that clients will end up dictating to us, and then equally we end up dictating to our supply chain as well. And where does the risk sit with that? If we're instructing somebody to do something a certain way, who holds that risk if it goes wrong, for argument's sake? The clients specify something, it's not quite as good as what perhaps the supply chain would have specified for us. Something terrible happens later. Where does that sit? I think, I can't can't help but keep harping on about understanding it and understanding how important quality is. I think that ultimately will help everything, but also getting the organisations to understand it. I was going to mention it on your previous slide, actually, Sally. It's about understanding the companies, the businesses, understanding how important quality is, and about putting it shoulder to shoulder with health and safety, and understanding where it sits, and about how it needs to be, ideally, needs to be independent. Quality managers and quality teams need to be independent from the actual works. You know, all of the auditors that are listening today will tell you, you can't audit your own work. It doesn't work like that. And ultimately, this is what we're being forced to do in some of our organisations.
Yeah, and that is always a challenge, to do it honestly and accurately. If you're just checking on your own things, you're inclined to be kind to yourself rather than harsh on yourself. So my next question was really about how can the new standard help tackle these issues? And I think we've touched several times now in these discussions, but also in the early meetings that we've had in the panel, that we have a cultural issue here. It is really about developing a culture of quality and a culture of integrity about quality. It's not just about meeting requirements. This is about behaviours of everybody and ensuring that the leadership is supporting those behaviours, that it's not always this race to the bottom. It's not always about getting the cheapest possible supplier to bring something in, you know, as quickly and as cheaply as possible, but actually that quality is fundamental to what we're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Some of the similar issues I believe that every company has is or are issues around understanding roles and responsibilities, understanding the materials that we're using and how to install them. You know, when should we be doing quality inspections? You know, accountability. You know, who's accountable for signing off what we are installing? Yeah, you know, so many times you've got people wearing too many hats within a business, and they're all making a decision, and then the next minute none of them are making a decision because they all think someone else is. You know, the understanding of who ultimately takes responsibility for what we install, what is then used out there. You know, who is taking responsibility for that? Yeah, I think if my memory serves me correct, please don't ask me to quote it, but I was on a webinar with Dame Judith Hackett, and she was mentioning about her report and the findings that she had. And I believe one of the things that she was saying was, you know, about who is signing these projects off to say that they are safe. Okay, this is only going to get tougher. You know, we have to prove what we are installing and that it is safe. So who is actually responsible for that? Are they competent to do that? Yeah, we're assigning these people roles and responsibilities, but we must make sure that the individuals undertaking those activities are competent to do so. You wouldn't ask, for argument's sake, for fear of upsetting someone, a teacher to go and do some brain surgery. It's as ridiculous as that. You just wouldn't do it. So why are we doing that on our construction sites? Why are we allowing people to manage and be responsible for signing stuff off if they are not competent? Who's in charge? Just who's managing these things? You know, we end up having so many people on projects, you know, in charge as such, but not one of them signs anything off. There's no accountability for what's actually been installed. And I think that's massively important. And it's something that we need to address with this standard. You know, who is taking responsibility for it?
Thank you. And let's just hold further discussion of that for a moment. Let's have a look just briefly about how things are changing in this space. Do you want to talk a little bit about this, Ian, before we go further into the specific issues?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things on that slide, Sally, just, you know, 2 or 3 bullet points don't really capture the complexity of new legislation and the dreaded B word that I'm sure everybody that is on this meeting understands how how big these things are likely to be. I think if I knew the answers to some of these issues, I'd be a very rich man by now. But yeah, so at the moment it's the draft building safety bill that will come into force next year, basically taking forward the reforms of the building safety system in line with proposals confirmed in the response to the Building a Safer Future consultation that was published in April. So I think, touching on what Nikki said about Dame Judith Hackett's independent review and how this consultation has detailed how the government intends to deliver the principles and recommendations for reform set out by that review. So part of 9001, for example, will refer to knowing what your legislation, the regulation locally is. So that will be a huge factor when the final bill comes into effect, and I think we're likely to cover that a little bit more later on. Now, Brexit, we've seen that UK CA marking as well as CE marking is around. I've written down minefield here, which again is perhaps a webinar in itself, as our colleagues in the policy team are repeatedly trying to cover and keep up with the ever-changing landscape of Brexit. And of course, on a very simple level, the standard model, the standard development model will be impacted by Brexit. UK or BSI maintaining full membership of CEN and CENELEC, that's the outcome that's going to happen going forward. But as our own regulation and things like UKCA marking come into effect, we start to look more inwardly at a UK market and look more inwardly at national standardisation and how that is going to change too. And then you've got tax concerns down there. I'm afraid I'm no tax expert, but that might make it look like a stroll in the park. So feel free for people to put comments in around that last bullet point. But you can see that, as you say in the heading there, needs and requirements are changing. That's exactly the reason why we feel that this is a critical time for the industry and that the standard is really arriving at the right time.
So talking about that, Ian, can you tell us a little bit more about the Building Safety Bill and how we can help organisations to comply with new legislation that may well be on its way?
Yes, and I think in a way quality, I think Nikki said this earlier, and you and I have certainly talked about this, that quality in a way is the correlation to health and safety in the sector. And there are existing laws around health and safety, which I think is likely to be what the Building Safety Bill starts to address from a quality aspect. Itself is really all about quality management, ensuring we have systems in place, implemented to deliver assets that meet requirements. So I think there's an element here that you get safer buildings. Certainly, when you look at things like Grenfell and the fact that there are existing high-rise buildings that have exactly the same issue that maintain, how do you then, push something through that increases the safety in those remaining buildings? So also you've got things like the establishment of a new building regulator, which is likely to be the HSE, implementing this new regime for higher risk buildings, acting as the building control authority. And then also powers around marking and identification of construction products. Takes us back to that CA marking aspect again. And then I think there's an aspect really that talks around assisting and encouraging competence among the built environment industry and building control inspectors. And there's that piece of work that BSI is doing on the back of MHCLG, talking about competence and a framework around that too, and the terminology we use and the requirements for those type of job titles. So I think how can the new standard help organisations comply with it? I think time will tell, because I think they're working through it at the moment. But certainly in terms of quality and the recommendations of the Hackett review, she has stated that quality is the heart of that, and that culture change you touched on earlier. It has to be that we deliver that culture change, and the aspect of 9001 around top management will be a big part of that, I think.
Nikki, do you want to come in?
Yeah, totally agree with you, Ian. Absolutely. So, they say, don't they, the quality of today is the health and safety of tomorrow. So, yeah, definitely. And getting the top management or senior management to understand the importance and align quality with health and safety will absolutely help. Until there is some legislation that says quality is law, we're going to have those difficulties. Health and safety, if you don't do it, there's a good chance you could end up in court. Whereas with quality, we don't currently have that. And I think we will end up needing something like that to just absolutely drive this. And when people understand that the majority of health and safety issues, incidents happen during rework, a lot of the time incidents happen because people aren't following process and procedure. That's all quality based. And when people really understand that, they'll really understand just how important quality is. So going back to my point I made earlier, and maybe a little bit hasty, but when people understand that quality needs to be independent within a business, shoulder to shoulder with something as important as health and safety, until that happens, I don't think there's going to be that complete shift.
So Grenfell was a bit of a wake-up call, wasn't it, to the industry in some ways, in that generally with health and safety, we go, somebody fell off a crane. You can see an impact instantly.
Yeah.
But with quality failings, it may be some years before you realise the devastating impact. And I think Grenfell was the worst kind of light being shined on. This is what quality failings can lead to.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The thing that I think people don't understand is there are quality failings pretty much every week in the construction industry. You have windows falling out of high rises because the windows haven't been installed correctly. I know Grenfell is absolutely terrible, and that's why it's triggered so much. But we've kind of failed in the fact that we've missed all of these other opportunities before it. There's been some research that's been carried out on the possibility of another Grenfell happening again. And it's 100% for sure that it will happen again. And unless we address stuff now and we get things in place so that we are helping to prevent this, I'm afraid to say that there's likely to be further deaths. And we've got to do something about it. We've not got it right. And I'm not saying that not everybody's got the right idea. I'm just saying we haven't come together as a collective and actually made it something enough to make sure that everybody is following and making quality as important as health and safety. Sorry, I'm quite passionate about that. It just really upsets me, the fact that people don't see it as important, and it really is. And I don't want it to be too late again.
And this is why we're excited to be bringing people together who are passionate about it, who do understand the consequences of quality failings. They are devastating.
Absolutely devastating.
Or they can be. They have the potential to be devastating.
Devastating for lots of different reasons. I mean, obviously for the loss of life, but also financially. I don't think a lot of companies quite understand that if they got quality right, they would make huge savings within their total budgets of their project. Nobody's happy to put the money up front to get quality in place, but they always find the money to put things right, and it costs millions. And until people see how it affects them in their pocket, that I don't think they always get it, but it does. And if we just was to concentrate on starting our projects to finish rather than starting our projects to put the first spade in the ground, we'd probably be in a better place.
And this, guys, we've only got 5 minutes left. I knew the time would gallop past, so we're going to have to be very brief. And I know we've still got questions in the chat boxes. But I think what you're saying, Nikki, is very much related to this slide here about the golden thread. We need joined up thinking. We've got to have that collective responsibility throughout a life cycle of a project. Would you agree?
I do agree. I mean, put really simply, the golden thread is just how your organisation aligns itself to its goals, pretty much, and it links into your strategic objectives and what have you. I'd suggest that perhaps within the ISO, it's always been an unspoken requirement anyway, but maybe if we just emphasise on it a bit more.
You have to speak it.
Exactly. Somebody mentioned in one of our groups about making the standard or the ISO more difficult to achieve. I do believe that it needs to be stringent, absolutely, but I think it just needs to be very clear so that everybody understands it and there's no interpretation necessarily. And then it's really easy for the auditors to be able to ask for the right evidence to be able to prove it. I think if we do that, even as a start, I think it would go a huge way to making it more valuable, and we know what we get out of it.
Thank you. I'm going to, rather than continuing through our slides, I'm going to just pull a few of these questions out of our live questions that are coming through. I don't want the audience to feel that we're not listening to them. We absolutely are. So very, very brief thoughts on these, please. Can the new standard facilitate quality being funded from company budgets rather than being pushed to project budgets? Is it going to help with that? And if you don't think it is, what can we do to help with that?
You want me to answer that one?
Give it a go. Or Ian, if you're ready.
I personally think it should stay at project, and I'll tell you for why. If your project manager, let's just do this as an example, okay? If your project manager is on a bonus for completing his project, okay, he will try his best to get everything done in the cheapest, quickest way that he can, okay? If your quality budget is coming out of that, he is then being held accountable for the quality that goes in it. If you put that to head office, for argument's sake, they're never going to really see it or feel it. And they need to feel it. These project managers, take away the bonuses for getting projects finished on time. Take that away, because that will stop a lot of this deliver attitude that everybody has. And they forget about all of the other stuff that needs to be done. Sorry to quote this, but I think it was the A14. They got criticised by their client for planning too much at the beginning. And yet, by planning as much as they did, they actually finished their project 8 months early. So they saved a huge amount of money. And it was all because they prepared, they planned. 80% preparation,
Absolutely.
So quality at the beginning, guys. Put it
it's
in.
Against the 5 or 6 P's, however many P's there are. The perfect planning prevents. I won't finish the sentence, but
poor performance.
Performance will do it. Yeah, that's right. Family show. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Nikki. I think it's a concern that over planning has been criticised. Actually goes against some of the conversations we've had in the workshop. And picking up on the anonymous question where it said about budgets, health and safety and quality budgets being separate. From this type of conversation, it would suggest actually those budgets should be the same. How could you say that not spending on quality, if you're talking about something emotive as Grenfell, maybe that quality underspend is a health and safety issue, and clearly it took a lot of life before we realised it. I think it was Hugh in the chat saying that there was almost another Grenfell in Worcester Park. Probably not quite as public because nobody died, but that's a wake-up call in itself. So this is, as you say, 100% likely to happen again. And if it comes down to it was because of budgets, then the top management, using that terminology, is really going to have to look somebody in the eye and say, well, I didn't spend for what reason exactly?
That's right.
Where we're at. Hopefully that answers the question. But these are all of the chat, Sally, things we have about 60 seconds left to go. I think needs to be captured, and you can imagine the number of people that we've got on the panel and the breadth of expertise from this industry that we've got. A lot of this is echoing what's in those people's minds, but valuable material for us to take into those conversations. Thank you to everyone.
Absolutely, Ian. And thank you to you both for being flexible in answering questions that you had no preparation for. And I would just like to say to our audience, we haven't managed to answer all the questions, and I apologise for that. But equally, we can't yet answer all the questions. It's too early in the process. So I would really encourage you to stay in contact with us if this is something you are passionate about, if this is something you would like to help address, please get in touch with us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.